Welcome to Slight Reliability, the show where we learn SRE and observability 1 week at a time. I'm Stephen Townsend. Welcome back to Slight Reliability. I'm Stephen Townsend, and this is the show where we learn about SRE and observability 1 week at a time. Today, I am here with Amin Astaneh, who has spent the last 15 years of his career guiding teams on how to better run production systems. His resume includes companies like Meta and Acquia, where he led dramatic turnarounds using site reliability engineering and DevOps best practices. And his experience as both an engineer and a manager has given him a unique perspective on how to approach problems. He now runs a consultancy called Certo Modo, based in Boston, Massachusetts, where he offers similar transformations for his clients. So welcome, Amin. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Stephen. Thanks for having me.
So a little while ago, Amin worked for a company called Acquia. Did I say that right?
Acquia, you got it.
Acquia, okay. And he was part of a really successful implementation, or I guess you could say transformation for SRE. So that's really what we're going to talk about today, and how that went and what the challenges were along the way. So before we start though, who is Acquia?
So are you familiar with the open source project Drupal, the CMS?
Yeah.
The founder of the Drupal project, Dries Spijtart, is the CTO of Acquia. So that company provides support and hosting and professional services for Drupal. Over the past few years, they've branched out to like a digital experience platform, but their foundation is based on Drupal as a primary technology.
That's cool.
So a lot of corporate customers use Acquia for like the brochureware websites, and there's some larger sites like NBC, which is a big news outlet and channel outlet in the United States.
That's cool. And when SRE sort of started to enter the equation, what kind of role did you have?
Oh, right. Yeah. So that started happening at around 2015, 2016. So I joined the company in late 2010. At the time, I was a manager on the operations team. So this was pre-DevOps. SRE wasn't even really a thing that was off talk about. And my responsibility was for the provisioning, monitoring, and incident response for customer sites. And I started to notice that, hey, the amount of toil and manual labor involved in setting up customers, doing capacity planning, changing their hardware configuration, and also just like the raw incident response work got me really thinking about, is there a better way to do this? And after a lot of research, I discovered SRE practices, not in the SRE book, actually a book that was published a few years earlier called The Practice of Cloud System Administration. And it had I
was going to say, because the SRE book came out in 2016, so you would have been just on the edge when it first came out. Yeah,
it's right. Yeah. So what happened was that book got published. One of the authors is Tom Limoncelli, who was formerly a Google SRE. So he provided like a view into this world that prior the tech industry had no idea what SRE was. It was a purely insular thing to Google. I mean, it started in 2003.
The idea to go into SRE, is that something that came from you, or did it come from some sort of leader, and did you call it SRE at the time, or did you just say we're going to shake up how we do our operations? Yeah,
there was definitely some iteration. So at first, like 2015, 2016, I was still coming down from reading the book, The Phoenix Project, which was the seminal book about DevOps. And I was thinking about, a lot of the business problems in terms of that. But I was starting to get into SRE concepts to that book. I had a really good, like executive sponsor at the company. His name's Christopher Stone, and he was the chief products officer at the time. And he started seeing some of the things I was doing and the metrics I was gathering and some of the things I talk about with him. And he decided to start getting budget for SRE and a team for automation, and handed me the reins. That's how that began, basically.
And so how long were you at Acquia for, and how long, was this process going for you?
Sure. So I was at Acquia for 9 years. So wow. From the end of 2010 to the end of 2019. And the DevOps transformation, or the SRE transformation, started in 2016 and lasted through 2019. So I was my primary role was driving that initiative for over 3 years.
We had a little catch up about a week ago, and I was really interested in what kind of challenges that you faced along the way, because the short, 1.5 year period that I was I had a lot of them. And so I was curious. Some of the challenges that you mentioned along the way were related to the ops team side of things, and some of them were related to the product. So maybe we could start with the ops world, the ops team, and what sort of barriers you hit along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. So originally I was in operations. That's where I came from. So I have a pretty strong system administration background. So I was a manager on that team. And at the time, one of my primary responsibilities was, of course, like managing the on-call rotation, but also like managing the work in progress. So we were using Jira, and we had tickets being submitted by everybody in the ticketing system. Everyone was depending on us. Support organization depended on us, account management, even engineering, because we were deploying and running the product for them. But the problem was the work wasn't really visible. So you had this big bucket of tickets in Jira, but we weren't like really organizing it in a way that made work like obvious to the business, like how our time's being spent and things like that. So they understood what ops is like expenditure is in terms of effort and time. And again, like everyone in the org depended on ops for something. So we were a constraint. And prioritization, because there wasn't really a process to manage work, prioritization was based on who was screaming the loudest.
Yeah.
And that, of course, is not very optimal. Right. So we're running around like with our hair on fire the whole time. So one of the things I had to first do was, we're going to create a Kanban. We're going to execute on work from the most important downward. And then we needed to have a discussion with the stakeholders about, okay, you are all of our customers. We need to come together and have a discussion about what the most important things in the business are. And then we will prioritize that. And I will give you metrics on how many tickets we're able to do, and we'll hold ourselves accountable to that throughput. And I'll tell you something, that first conversation was not pleasant. Because I basically I opened up Pandora's box. Like I revealed to all of my stakeholders that, the operations team isn't the dedicated team for just them. We were a constrained resource, and that created a lot of initial frustration.
So these different stakeholders are all in the room together and seeing each other. Hey, no, we use these people. You can't use them. No, we need. And how did it go in terms of getting them to agree what gets priority?
I think it took a week of just some conversations, and for folks to have some empathy for each other. So like every team has a very important responsibility. I mean, the engineering team, like they're depending on ops again. Ops is running the flagship product. It's a 150 million ARR business as of 2019 when I left. So this is no joke. So engineering depended on us, support depended on us for, managing the customer relationship. If there was issues with, their site or with a feature or something that requires some in-depth Linux or PHP or, LAMP stack type debugging, we needed to get involved because we understood the stack. And then account management, they needed us to do capacity planning for renewals because, as a customer grows, they may need more equipment. So having that conversation about here's all of the types of work that we do, I think it created a general sense of empathy, like, oh, wow, this team does a lot. Okay, well, let's horse trade and kind of bargain and collaborate to figure out, what should ops do now versus tomorrow. But yeah, it was very touch and go there from the beginning, a lot of heated emotions, to be frank. But I think the end result was, pretty positive. It was a very important conversation that we needed to have.
It makes me think a little bit about, in my previous role, we talked a lot about glue work. So there's the work, the flashy, stuff that people are doing to create new features or innovate some new thing. But then there's all of this work which is constantly happening just to keep the place running. And it's so necessary, but it's invisible. No one sees it happening. And there's no reward for those people which are like doing this incredible work that no one ever sees. And I feel like the whole ops world, it's sort of susceptible to that, maybe more than other parts of the organization.
That team was very toil heavy. Like every stakeholder that I was mentioning in our conversation just now, they were all requesting tasks from ops that were purely manual. Capacity planning required us to look at graphs and to extrapolate, okay, this is where the equipment is going to need to be in the next 6 months to a year. Code releases at the time was very manual. We didn't have a full-on CD system, and the CI system had some limitations. So there was that. And then of course, on the support side, like we're jumping on servers, running system call tracers, trying to figure out what's going on under the hood in PHP. So again, manual everywhere. So yeah, it's very much glue. And, the ideal state is that you would have technology, tooling in the least, and full-on features at best to automate away this work. But at that time, that was the situation we were in. Glue is, I think that's the right analogy.
I'm curious, before we talk a little bit about how you reduce some of that toil, did you measure the toil? Did you take the time to sort of say, this is how much toil roughly each team or overall we're dealing with each day? And how did you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I wrote some tools, some in Bash, some in Ruby. It integrated with Toggle. So Toggle is a time tracking application. Like a lot of companies use it, and like consultants, like myself, use it to track time on projects. But there is a Jira integration with Toggle.
Okay.
So I wrote some code that talked to the Toggle API and would enable ops people to track time almost like automatically, when they're doing ticket work. And if you didn't track time on a ticket, you can run a script and it would say, okay, here's all of the work items that you didn't track time on, make your estimations, and then you would be able to do it. So that in combination with classifying the work. So, like the Phoenix project talks about there's 4 types of work, but really what we're talking about in the SRE work, we're just talking about, is it toil or is it not toil, right? So I was able to quantify from this team day to day the amount of hours that were spent on toil. And I put that on a dashboard in Grafana. And I went and showed it to the C-level, saying this is how much money we are spending on toil as of this moment, month to month. And that was like probably the turning point, because it allowed the organization to conceptualize the amount of money that they are setting literally on fire to maintain the status quo. And I think it was that data provided the necessary urgency to start doing things differently.
It's kind of blowing my mind because I'm running a talk right now about monitoring other kinds of things that aren't technology. One of them is toil. And my conclusion, having spoken to everyone else, is that it's actually impossible to measure toil in an automated way without sort of having an undue overhead of time entry. But it sounds like even if you do it for a short period of time, just to have that knowledge to say to leadership, this is how much you are spending. It sounds like a powerful message. You've kind of won me over there.
Yeah, well, thank you. It was a pain in the butt to track time. I'm not gonna gloss that fact over. It is definitely a pain in the butt to track time. But everyone on the team understood that participating in the process gave them the ammunition to make changes. So people were very much motivated to do it. And again, like I wrote tooling to help, make it as easy as possible.
So how did you go about reducing the amount of toil that their team was dealing with?
Yeah, this is awesome. Actually, this is probably like one of my favorite stories to talk about from the ops side of the house. So there were a couple things. It was an iteration of solutions over time. I think like around 2014. So this is even before like I was starting to think about DevOps and SRE and all of this. I began to realize that, hey, there's a lot of tickets hitting the queue that have a certain format. I have a customer, I have an environment that the customer owns, I have a config setting, and I have a value. And there were a lot of tickets coming and saying, yeah, set the PHP memory limit on this environment to 256 megs or whatever, because ops had access to production. They had the ability to change the configuration. So I built an API it was an API service that allowed like support and teams to request tickets in a JSON blob. And the JSON blob would go in Jira, so that way there was still a ticket tracking the work. But then I wrote this tool that would take all of these special tickets, parse the JSON blob, and then execute the plugin specified by the type of request. And it used a bash subshell, so it was running as the ops user. So all they had to do was run the tool, and it was like, oh, okay, I have these changes that are available for you to run. Well, do you approve them? Because so you want to explicitly like look at them and be like, hey, that PHP memory limit is 1 gigabyte. That doesn't sound very good. I'm not going to allow that to go through. But it translated that manual like running CLI tools to just approval. And that was a 15% elimination of ticket work overnight. Like the moment that we released that thing and made it available. Yeah, that was like the first big win. But the second stage, and interrupt me at any time, the second stage was even more interesting. So I was talking about a very small subset of work that has a certain format. In 2016, I started learning about JSON schema. So JSON schema is like basically a way to use JSON to specify a data structure and how it's supposed to like the way it's supposed to look. And then you can validate your JSON against the schema. And if it matches, then you know that you got data that you are expecting, which is really cool. So So
you can kind of define your own particular standard structure for something that you want to represent, and then you can use the schema to validate that your JSON matches that. Is that kind of it?
You got the idea, 100%. So I used JSON schema to basically make so we were talking about the old solution, we were talking about an API. This was a web app. And the web app had the ability to take JSON schema and turn it into web forms, like turn it into an HTML form. And that gave us the ability to specify, okay, for every issue type that we have, we are going to write out in JSON specification of what the request should look like and the required information to request that particular task. And then the service, we called it Ops Portal. It went and took that form submission, did a few API calls to validate the input even further than what JSON schema could do. And then it would actually write out the ticket in the queue in the language of the ops person. And it even linked to Runbooks, and it did a whole bunch of stuff to make it really easy for the ops person to know what to do. But then also it provided up front the required information to perform a task to the support person or the account manager. So that cut lead time for ops tickets across the board by 50%.
It's so awesome.
Yeah, it was wild.
So when it happens very quickly like that, I'm imagining there's a lot of like thought that went into that beforehand, though, to say, what's the situation? How can we? What's the best point to hit it that we reduce, time?
Yeah, it's the negotiation. So the thing is, and I know we're talking a bit about IT right now, an IT process. We haven't even gotten into the engineering world yet, but so like in terms of like trouble tickets or requests from users, people tend to do that through just free form text. So there is this step where you say, like, you read the ticket and you say, okay, I think you're asking for X, Y, and Z. Is that correct? And there has to be this negotiation and back and forth to ensure that what the ticket requester is asking for is in fact what they mean. And sometimes they might ask for things that are not in scope, and we have to have the conversation saying, I'm sorry, we can't do this because this isn't within the scope of the team, which is a very reasonable thing to say for a team that has so much responsibility. So by having the portal up, which has a menu of all the things you can request, it makes sure that you don't have teams asking for things that are not in scope. And then it also, cuts out that whole negotiation process of trying to figure out if the ticket's actionable and getting the necessary information. It always is upfront, present every time. And that cut a lot of the lead time.
That's very cool. What about teams who have an unusual request which doesn't fit into the standard set of tickets that people can raise, but it is something that only your team can answer or look into?
Sure. So of course there were a couple of backdoors. One of them was, hey, I have a customer issue, and we would have a free form box. But so I guess the ticket specification and Ops Portal was very loose. It was like, just describe the problem. Like, what's the customer trying to do? What's the outcome? Can you upload some pictures? That sort of thing. So we made it as loose as possible. And then of course for emergencies, we had a ticket type that if you filed it, it would hit PagerDuty and it would hit us immediately. And there was an understanding that if you're using that, it is in fact an emergency. And then you can provide whatever information you think is useful. We're not going to constrain you. So we had some backdoors in the system to enable that type of dialogue. But if there is a task type that is supported by Portal and you request it, but not using the portal, we won't take it because we already have a system that standardized the issue intake.
I was going to ask about Runbooks. So I have very little experience myself on call, right? And I love the idea of a runbook. Do you have any stories about runbooks at Acquia, or improving them at all, or were they already in a pretty good place?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I think for operations, we had a pretty reasonable, like, iterative process because we needed it for ourselves, right? Because the pressure on us to get tickets out the door was so great that we were going to, write runbooks. And so basically we iterated through multiple types of storage for it. Like for a time we were using DokuWiki, and then we were using MediaWiki, and then we actually ended up just using GitHub and writing Markdown. And the cool thing about that is that, okay, you create a pull request, and now you're having a discussion about, we are changing this process for how to perform a task. And because here's the thing, Runbooks is code for humans. Like that's the way that I always describe it. So I think using GitHub to store runbooks actually makes a lot of sense, because you can then have a discussion about, I think we should do this change. This is why we should do it this way. And then there's a collaborative discussion about whether or not that change is beneficial or not. So on the ops side, I think runbooks were pretty mature, or at least continuously improving, I think is the right term for that. As for engineering on the SRE side, when I was running, engagements and building out the SRE competency, we had to introduce engineers to runbooks.
Wow.
So one of our SREs wrote a template runbook, and it was used for like incident types, like types of failures, like alerts you get. So he wrote this joke runbook from the perspective of like being on the show Scooby-Doo, and you're trying to like, oh, you see a spooky ghost, this is what you do in response to this spooky ghost, and this is what you do in response to this, cartoon villain. But he made it like humorous, so that way it was easily digestible by the engineering team. But I think for engineering, we had to provide a lot of examples of, this is what a runbook would look like for an alert. Like, for example, here's a description, like this is the alert message that you got, this is a description, here's the steps to follow, here's a dashboard to look at, here's remediation steps. So that way engineers could easily pick that up and say, oh, okay, I know what to do with this, and then bulk out their runbooks. And mostly runbooks in the context of software engineering teams, usually from the beginning, is what do I do in response to an alert? I think, later on they start iterating on their own routine tasks and manual processes.
So to clarify, when you say engineering, you're kind of talking about the engineering teams who traditionally would build software, more so the sort of product teams. Is that what you mean by engineering?
Correct.
Yeah. And at what point were engineering teams involved in dealing with incidents before this started, or was it something that happened as part of this process?
Oh my, yes, what a lovely question. So for the flagship product, which is where a lot of my efforts were applied to, considering that was the biggest moneymaker for the business, there was a period of time where the engineering team was not on call. So the operations team, the buck stopped literally with me. And if I wasn't able to solve the problem, I would have to fish around for phone numbers and appeal to get an engineer to jump in. So it wasn't part of the responsibility, at least for that team. There were some smaller teams in the periphery for acquisitions and things like that were already used to on-call, but for the flagship, that wasn't the case. So one of the first things that we did when I started SRE at Acquia was to say, okay, if you're writing code that contributes to the customer experience in any way, shape, or form, which in this case is everyone, you're going to be a part of an on-call rotation. We have to own our service.
How did they go down? I mean, how did they respond to that?
You know what? I remember having this fear that I was going to say something and it was really going to upset them. Like the idea of introducing on-call was going to be this very controversial thing, and there was going to be a lot of resistance. But believe it or not, that was not the case. I think they all understood that, again, they are running something that is really important to other people, and if they weren't on call, they're going to get called, by me one way or the other. So I think they had this understanding that yes, let's adopt this responsibility. It did help that I did put together a compensation structure and brought that to leadership and say, okay, for every incident, we should pay this much. And I think having a monetary incentive made it a little bit easier for engineers to swallow if they were, silently grumbling about the change. So we did
Okay,
have
but if you
a
get
per
paid
incident.
per incident, I mean, sure, isn't that just incentive to say, let's just introduce a bunch of bugs which cause incidents so we get paid more?
I mean, yeah, isn't that a perverse incentive? I think that was, I agree. Like in retrospect, I probably wouldn't have done that. I would have done it per shift. But I think the reason why we were doing per incident is because there were teams with steady state incident rates that were pretty not okay. So we wanted to get out in front and pay and fairly compensate people for the impact of on-call to their lives. If I were to implement an on-call compensation structure today, I would do per day or per shift flat. Another aspect that I think about as well is that you should not place any expectation on an on-call to do any project work during their shift. Like, you should not be contributing to the sprint. You should not be contributing to features. You should be contributing to the reliability of the system. Full stop.
I like that. And okay, so you've got the engineering teams, and they may not have necessarily the right capabilities or skills in the team yet. How did you sort of inject the knowledge on how to deal with incidents and do operational work?
I mean, it was a two-pronged approach. So the first one is, well, the SRE program, I started doing embedded engagements. So there's multiple engagement. We can take a step back. There's multiple engagement models for SRE, and the one that people tend to think about from Google is, I built out an entire team. I will take most of the operational responsibility of a service from you, so you can write features, and we'll share a little bit of on-call with you. We'll share a little bit of toil with you, so you're in touch. But we got most of it. That's a classic Google model. So the embedded model, in contrast, which I think makes a lot of sense for teams that aren't as gigantic as Google, is you take an engineer or two and you embed them on the engineering team. They become members of that team. They're onboarded. They understand how to contribute to the code base. They understand the team dynamics and the processes. And from inside, they become change agents, and they are introducing these things. So, as part of an SRE engagement, the process was, okay, we're going to do something I called an operational responsibility assessment, which actually comes from the Practice of Cloud System Administration book, Appendix A. So we're just asking a bunch of questions like, how do you do XYZ when you're operating the service? And it allowed us to get the shape of the maturity of the service across dimensions such as, how does ticketing work? How does on-call work? How does monitoring work? And that information showed us what we needed to focus on. But regardless, every team needed to establish SLOs. And if you're establishing service level objectives, you need to establish an on-call process to respond when error budgets are being spent. So the embedded engagement created a setup where you had an SRE on the team that was introducing the engineers to this process and also taking part in it too. They were part on call as well. They were feeling the pain. And I think that engagement model is really useful because it builds a sense of credibility on the team. You're not just coming in from the outside saying, you should do X, Y, Z. You're actually being a member of the team, feeling the pain and saying, okay, I think we should do X, Y, Z in order to improve our quality of life. And so that's the first prong. The second prong is we published a lot of internal best practices in our wiki that we shared with everyone, and would also do like periodic office hours. That was actually a really interesting thing. We did office hours for years where we would, for an hour, just make ourselves available for any question any team had. And we would record it and we would upload it to the company's internal YouTube so that people could consume it later. So that's a more of a consulting engagement model, as I would call it, where you're basically responding to any, request from the organization, and you're providing things like best practices. You might be, guiding postmortems and things like that. So in terms of like, how do you introduce engineers to on-call? Yeah, we had a lot of materials to share with engineers about how to get started if they didn't have an SRE, for example, which was the case for several teams.
The brief foray that I had in that SRE enablement team, it was a little bit of embedding, a little bit of consulting, more consulting, because we're a team of a start of 4 people for an organization with 13,500 staff and over 1,000 just engineers. There was just no way that we could embed, and we would embed, and then we'd have like 2 teams affected, and that was it. So it was more a matter of people coming to us and saying we want to do this better, and then we would facilitate essentially and ask questions like you said, and dig out information from their monitoring and analytics data to figure out, hey, there's a pattern here, we could change this and make it better.
Yes.
Yeah. On the topic of SLOs, anyone who's listened to my podcast knows I'm actually a little bit, I guess, critical of SLOs, or I'm sort of skeptical about how difficult they are to implement in a meaningful way. I am keen, before I sort of rip into that further. How did you implement SLOs? Like, what are some examples of how you made it work?
That's also a really good question. Just like anything else, it was an iterative process. One of the things that I did first was I went and launched the tiniest service that we could run, on AWS, and created mock SLOs and made dashboards for it. So the point behind that was I could provide engineers with documentation for a running service and be able to show them, this is the SLO for the service. Here is the latency SLO, right? And here is the success rate SLO, which are usually the two dimensions I tend to use, because it's really easy to express, and customers care about those two things a lot, like the most. So I provided first an example, and then as part of the embedded model that I was talking about earlier, one of the primary goals at the beginning of any engagement, before SRE starts, digging into architectural issues or focusing on how to get feature flow, going, SLOs was always on the table from the get-go, from the start. And I mean, one of the big things that was required was basically a lot of talking and a lot of discussion. Because what I've learned over the years, and I picked this up more at Meta than I did at Acquia, but in retrospect, like there needs to be a discussion about what it means to be up, and having that be stated in terms of what the customer can experience and feel, right? If you're thinking about things automatically from the technology point of view or the service point of view, you've already lost. Like, it needs to be something that the product manager can say, oh yeah, these are things that the customer would care about. And yes, I think that the P95 latency of this endpoint should be, 300 milliseconds, because I really want this thing to be fast and customers expect it too. Like, so I noticed at Acquia that there was a bit of conversation that had to happen, particularly between product and, the engineering team, in order to get something written down, in terms of SLIs at least. So it is an iterative process. And I think some teams did better on this than others. And I think there were some teams that I think in some cases didn't want to do it because I think they were afraid of the consequences of, once they have it established and they're held accountable to it, what would happen if they break it? Which I think is a reasonable fear to have when you're going through a lot of changes on a team already, and there's a lot of pressures for feature delivery. So that was a natural tension that I also saw.
I don't mean to sort of drag you into my past, but
sure.
Here's an example. What if you had a team, and so, okay, let's say there's a customer-facing feature, and maybe they click a button to get something. And when they click that button, it actually passes through maybe 10 different components owned by 10 different teams. Like, that's not ideal, like for modern, for the digital age, to organize teams that way, right? You ideally want value stream teams, but if you have a team who's just part of a small component and part of a big chain, can that team implement SLOs, or would you recommend it, even if they're not directly customer facing? I
would say so. Even if it's merely just an internal exercise, because every team should understand what their scope is. Every team should have, a clearly defined boundary of what they're responsible for, and being able to measure that, I think, is really important. If anything else, the attempt of producing SLOs for an internal facing team, like maybe you're just an API service or something, gets you to think about observability, gets you to think about why you're there and the value you're providing. I think it's a good exercise in general for those fringe benefits. But yeah, should a team implement SLOs? Yeah, absolutely. I think the interesting part is when you have SLO performance that is tied to dependencies on other teams.
Yeah. And
how do you, what do you do in that situation? Like, if your Arab budget got spent, but all of that got spent because you have an upstream team that had a problem. The way that I approach that question, because I've seen that question a lot, is I would say, okay, I would be collaborating with that team and figuring out what needs to be done in order to resolve those issues. Because it at the end of the day, that is going to go up the chain. It's going to affect the customer experience. So we should have the ability to measure, our service and how we're performing to people that depend on us.
Yeah. I've been in a situation where you're not talking about two teams who depend on each other. You're talking about there's a team who does the web UI, and then there's the
Yeah.
sort of digital layer APIs, then there's the business API layer, then there's the core system here, another core system, there's the reference data system, and then there's the pricing engine team, and they all need to work together to provide like one button click response. Wow, that's really difficult. And then I've been in a situation pre-SLO where they were calling, talking about NFRs and how much time each component could take in order to provide a certain experience to the customer, and asking me at the time I was a performance engineer to sort of, tell everyone how much time they can have, and the political nightmare that started when you're like, you need to take this much time, but they get to get this much time, and it's just.
Yeah, it does sound really tough. I definitely agree. I think you're pointing something out, which I will concede that is true. Certain organizational structures don't lend themselves well for internal SLOs, and also in certain organizational cultures don't lend themselves well immediately to implementing SLOs. Because if you have people playing tug of war over how much latency each team can have and the total latency that the service is taking up, then that sounds confrontational, not collaborative.
Observability. My understanding, I've been learning more about it. I had this completely warped idea of what it was, and I wanted it to be more than it was. But observability, from the definition of the book, which I've got in my cupboard over there, it's really about understanding what's happening within really complex distributed technology systems. And for me, like the core aspect of that to handle unknown unknowns is distributed tracing. Did you have distributed tracing going at Acquia?
Oh no, I didn't get introduced to that until I was at Meta. I mean, I understood that distributed tracing, of course, existed at Acquia, but we didn't have the level of maturity yet to do it. And I think at the time, systems were still rather monolithic, so the benefit of doing so would have been limited. Right, the performance that we would be considering most of the time would be the performance of a customer's Drupal website. So APMs like New Relic was reasonably enough. Like you would have a pie chart, and it would say, okay, 60% of the latency is execution time in PHP, and this is how much it was on the database, and this is how much it was on Memcache, that sort of thing. Yeah. So we didn't need to do distributed tracing at Acquia at that stage yet. I think probably like after I've left. And they've re-architected their product quite a bit, and they're using Kubernetes. I can imagine it being used there, but yeah, we weren't in the place where distributed tracing made sense.
APM, when you've got a monolith, an APM is hugely valuable because you can see down to a line of code where something's going wrong or taking a long time. It's great. It makes sense. I thought we'll finish with a happy ending. What were the wins? What are sort of the progress of the big wins that you had over the time at Acquia?
So we already mentioned like what operations enjoyed, which was a 50% lead time reduction in ticket throughput, as well as a reduction in alerts. So they were doing a lot better after those changes. But on the engineering side, there was a big problem, during like 2018, 2019. There was a single process for releasing code to the flagship product. So you have a whole bunch of engineers putting all of their code on the release train, and then we would ship to each production environment, which was a one-to-one correspondence to an AWS account, and we would go down the line from account to account based on the level of business risk of doing it. So like we would start with our non-enterprise customers and enterprise customers, then our like white glove customers. So there was an order. But the thing was, this was a very long process. So the lead time, and we actually got data for this, which I think was huge. The amount of time it took from the moment that code was committed to the moment that code was in prod for a particular release, it was 80 days. And that was, of course, unacceptable to the business, because if a customer reported a bug, they're going to wait 80 days for the bug to be fixed for them? That's just not a good situation. So there was a architect on the team that created this concept known as component releases. Basically, his idea was, hey, we will go and package parts of our code in an apt package. And then we're going to use that as a build artifact and ship that particular feature or set of features that way. So what that meant was, if implemented, it would not be one release train, it would be many. And at the time, it was just like a suggestion or like a RFC. There was a document that was written. describing how it could be, but he wasn't getting a lot of traction. So I overheard this, and, being a lead of a team that could do engagements, I said, this is a really good idea. I'm going to assign 2 engineers immediately to your team to do this. Let's get it done. And I think the engagement was like 6 months, and they got that feature working. And then they also put together some like criteria around, okay, if you're doing component releases, here's the operational readiness you need to have in order to make sure you're doing it and not creating like a regression in the reliability. We wanted to make things better, not worse. But the end result was there were like a good number of the teams after that was starting to ship once every 14 days. So once a sprint, or even more often. So that bottleneck of value delivery for, again, biggest product in that company, that bottleneck got shattered, and value was able to flow more readily. I think that was probably the biggest win that was measurable in an SRE engagement that I ran at that company. That was the feather in my cap for sure.
So technology aside, you essentially gave teams the independence and ability to release sort of independently from anyone else. Is that kind of the end result?
Yes, though just to not give folks the wrong idea, you still have to do change management process. Like, you still have to think about, hey, what is the risk of my change to prod? Do I need to schedule a window? Do I need to do customer notifications? Those processes were still in place, but what it meant is instead of having everybody do it all at once, teams are able to independently do it, which increased throughput. But yes, they were able to do that with I mean, there was a little bit of like you first then me with things that are a little bit more tightly coupled, but for the most part, it wasn't. The split of the features was done in such a way that it wasn't required. I think finally I would probably mention that when I left the organization, the culture changed. Engineers understood the need to be on call and operationally responsible for the services in which they built. Operations, I think, had an understanding that they had new skills to learn too. A good number of us weren't like coding all the time, and I think we were starting to sharpen, that axe and start using that skill more often. So I think the major win was the culture. There was a higher sense of urgency about making the product easier to operate and make on call in particular an experience that is as pain-free as possible.
Super cool. Thank you so much, Amin, for coming on the show and talking about your experiences. It's not very often that I get to speak to someone who's implemented SRE and is willing to talk about their experiences and isn't coming from a vendor perspective of, we've got a tool and it does these amazing things. So it's really heartening to hear how much success you had with it. And it's actually making me really excited about taking SRE concepts and making them work in a way which actually helps engineers in the organization in the future.
Yeah, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure talking about it.
Thank you once again for tuning in to Slight Reliability. Hope you all have a wonderful week, and I will see you all next time.